June, 1816, New England. The farmer wakes to a landscape transformed, not by storm, not by flood, by frost. In June, the corn in his field stands frozen. The stalks are rigid. Ice crystals coat the leaves. It is the 9th of June. This should not be possible. He walks between the rows, touches a frozen plant. The ice is real. The damage is total. An entire planting destroyed. In summer, the sky above is grey, heavy. The sun rises but brings no warmth. The light is thin, insufficient. The morning feels like November, though the calendar says June. Smoke rises from his neighbour's chimney. In June. Because inside that house, people sit near the fire, wearing coats, in what should be summer. The farmer returns to his house. His wife already knows. The whole village knows. Everyone woke to the same impossible reality. Summer has failed to arrive. This is not isolated misfortune. Across Vermont, across Massachusetts, across Connecticut and New Hampshire, the same scene repeats. Farmers staring at frozen crops. Families preparing for catastrophe. 3 days later, on June 12th, snow falls. Not a brief flurry, substantial snow, accumulation. In mid-June, witnesses record 6 inches in some Vermont locations. People see summer snow and struggle to comprehend it. But this is not merely a New England problem. This is not regional bad weather. In Germany, governments declare states of emergency as crop failures become apparent. In Switzerland, authorities conduct surveys of food stocks and find reserves dangerously low. In France, bread prices begin climbing. In Ireland, conditions that were already difficult become catastrophic. Across Europe, across Eastern North America, across parts of Asia, the year without summer spreads its cold across the Northern Hemisphere. No one understands why. Scientists have no explanation. Governments have no solution. Religious leaders offer prayers that change nothing. People simply endure a year that feels like nature itself has broken. And beside Lake Geneva, a group of English travellers spend the dark, cold summer trapped indoors. The weather is too miserable for the outdoor activities they had planned, so they tell stories. One of them, 18-year-old Mary Godwin Shelley, begins writing during those gloomy days. A novel about a scientist who creates life from dead tissue. She will call it Frankenstein. She does not know she is writing during a global catastrophe, does not know the cold and darkness are connected to a volcanic eruption 10,000 miles away. An explosion so violent it killed tens of thousands instantly and would eventually cause the deaths of an estimated 100,000 more through famine and disease. No one knows. The science to explain volcanic winter does not yet exist. They know only that the sun seems dimmed, that summer has not come, that the world has changed in ways that feel terrifying and permanent. This is the year without summer. 1816. When volcanic aerosols from Mount Tambora's eruption circled the globe and plunged the northern hemisphere into cold. When crops failed across continents. When famine killed hundreds of thousands. When societies faced potential collapse. And when humanity learned that a single geological event could reshape civilization. We will trace this catastrophe from its violent beginning through its global consequences to its lasting legacy. From the mountain that exploded to the year that summer vanished to the world that emerged transformed. Every claim will be documented. Every number will be verified. This is researched history treating both science and human experience with appropriate gravity. We begin with fire, with an explosion so massive it destroyed a mountain, with the moment when nature demonstrated its power to reshape the world. We begin with Tambora. Chapter 1. The mountain explodes. April 1815. Sumbawa Island, in what is now Indonesia. April 10th, 1815. Mount Tambora has been showing signs of unrest for 3 years. Small earthquakes, steam venting from the summit. The people living on its slopes are concerned but not panicked. Volcanic activity is not unusual in the region. Mountains rumble. Usually nothing catastrophic follows. On April 5th, preliminary eruptions begin. Ash falls on villages. The ground shakes with increasing frequency. Some residents evacuate. Most remain. Their homes are here. Their fields are here. They have nowhere else to go. On the evening of April 10th, Tambora explodes with a force that will be calculated much later as a 7 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, a scale that ranges from 0 to 8. Only one confirmed eruption in human history reached 8. Tambora is among the most violent in recorded history. The sound is heard across the Indonesian archipelago. In Yogyakarta, on Java, approximately 800 kilometers away, British Administrator Thomas Stamford Raffles hears what he believes is distant cannon fire. He sends troops to investigate possible attack. There is no attack. The sound is a mountain destroying itself. The eruption column rises to a height that modern analysis estimates at approximately 43 kilometers, 27 miles. This reaches well into the stratosphere, far above the weather systems of the lower atmosphere. The column is not merely ash. It is pulverized rock, sulfur dioxide gas, water vapor. Millions of tons of material ejected with explosive force. The energy released is estimated at approximately 800 megatons, roughly 4 times the entire explosive yield of all weapons used in World War II. At Tambora's base, pyroclastic flows race down the mountain's slopes. These are avalanches of superheated gas and rock fragments. Temperatures exceed 600 degrees Celsius. Speeds approach 200 kilometers per hour. Everything in their path is incinerated. Forests, villages, people. The flows reach the sea and continue across the water's surface, their momentum so great that seawater does not immediately stop them. Tsunamis generated by the eruption strike nearby coastlines. The waves are not as large as those from submarine earthquakes, but still deadly to coastal communities already devastated by ashfall and pyroclastic flows. The eruption continues through the night of April 10th and into April 11th. The sound is continuous, deafening even at great distance. Witnesses hundreds of kilometers away describe being unable to sleep due to the noise. When the eruption finally subsides on April 11th, Mount Tambora has been transformed. The summit, which stood approximately 4,200 meters high, is gone. In its place is a caldera, a collapsed crater measuring approximately 6 kilometers across and more than 1 kilometer deep. 4,000 feet of mountain simply vanished, its material either ejected into the atmosphere or collapsed into the void below. The immediate death toll is catastrophic. Estimates vary because record-keeping in the region was limited and many villages were completely destroyed, leaving no survivors to report casualties. Modern scholarship generally estimates the direct death toll at approximately 71,000 people on Sumbawa and neighboring Lombok. Some estimates range higher, to 90,000 or more. Most deaths occur immediately. Pyroclastic flows kill instantly. Ashfall collapses structures, burying people alive. Tsunamis drown coastal populations. The eruption is so violent and comprehensive that entire communities cease to exist. The kingdom of Tambora, located on the mountain's slopes, is completely destroyed. An entire culture, including its unique language, is lost in a single night. Much later, archaeological excavations will uncover the buried kingdom, finding it preserved under volcanic deposits like Pompeii. But everyone who lived there is dead. On neighboring islands, ashfall continues for days. The ash accumulates to depths measured in feet in some locations. Fields are buried. Water sources are poisoned. Buildings collapse under the weight. Regions that survived the initial eruption face starvation as all vegetation is destroyed. But the immediate disaster, devastating as it is, represents only a fraction of Tambora's ultimate death toll. The true catastrophe is still developing. Invisible, high in the stratosphere, spreading. The eruption has injected an estimated 60 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere. This is not a precise measurement, as the technology to measure it did not exist in 1815. The figure comes from later analysis of ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica, which preserve chemical signatures of the eruption. Sulfur dioxide in the stratosphere undergoes chemical reactions with water vapor, forming sulfuric acid aerosols. These are microscopic droplets suspended in the thin air of the upper atmosphere. They are light enough to remain aloft for years. They spread globally, carried by stratospheric winds. These aerosols reflect sunlight. They act like a partial mirror surrounding Earth, bouncing solar radiation back into space before it can warm the surface. The effect is cooling. Global cooling. Modern calculations estimate the aerosols reduced incoming solar radiation by approximately 1 to 2%. This sounds small. It is not. Earth's climate operates on narrow margins. A 1% reduction in solar radiation is sufficient to drop global average temperatures by approximately 0.5 degree to 1 degree Celsius. For agriculture, this is catastrophic. Growing seasons depend on temperature thresholds. Plants require specific numbers of frost-free days to reach maturity. Frost dates determine whether crops succeed or fail. A 1 degree cooling shifts frost dates. Spring frost arrives later. Autumn frost arrives earlier. The growing season compresses. Crops that would have matured now fail. Regions that were marginally viable for agriculture become impossible. The aerosols will remain in the stratosphere for approximately 3 years. The cooling will be most severe in 1816, 1 year after the eruption, when aerosol concentration peaks. Effects will persist through 1817 and into 1818 before finally dissipating. But this is unknown to people in April 1815. They know a volcano erupted in the Dutch East Indies. British newspapers report it in August, 4 months after the event. The reports describe local destruction. They do not suggest global consequences. The idea that an Indonesian eruption could affect European or American climate is not part of scientific thinking in 1815. Volcanic eruptions are understood as local events with local impacts. The mechanisms by which eruptions affect global climate will not be understood for decades. So when strange weather begins in 1816, no one connects it to Tambora. The connection will only be established later by scientists analyzing historical climate data and volcanic chronology. The people who will experience the year without summer will do so without understanding. They will know their crops are failing. They will know the weather is wrong. But they will not know why. And that ignorance will make the catastrophe more terrifying. When disaster strikes without explanation, when nature itself seems to have broken, the psychological impact compounds the material suffering. Tambora has erupted. The aerosols are spreading. The catastrophe is developing. And humanity, unaware, continues through 1815 toward the year when summer will fail to arrive. Chapter 2. The Spreading Cold, Spring 1816. The aerosols spread through the stratosphere during the winter of 1815 to 1816. Stratospheric winds circulate them globally. By spring of 1816, the veil is established, invisible, undetectable by the instruments of the era, but present. Spring. 1816 begins inauspiciously. In New England, March brings typical late winter weather. Cold, but not extraordinary. April shows some warming, but less than normal. Contemporary temperature records from New Haven, Connecticut, kept by Professor Jeremiah Day of Yale College, show April temperatures averaging several degrees below the historical mean. May brings the first clear signs of crisis. Frost continues far later than normal. Farmers who planted in late April watch seedlings die. They replant. Those seedlings die too. Contemporary accounts from Vermont describe frost on May 19th that killed recently planted crops. This is late for killing frost even in northern New England. Farmers recognize the danger. The growing season is compressing. June brings catastrophe. On June 6th, freezing temperatures are recorded across New England. Snow falls in the interior regions. In Williamstown, Massachusetts, witnesses report snow accumulation. The snow melts quickly, but the damage to crops is total. The weather remains cold and unstable through June. Contemporary diary entries describe wearing winter clothing in mid-June. Fires burning continuously. Livestock kept in barns because the fields are too cold. On June 9th, the frost that began this narrative occurs. Widespread killing frost across New England. Corn frozen in fields. Gardens destroyed. June 9th, 1816. This date appears repeatedly in contemporary accounts as the moment when people recognize the full scope of the disaster. Snow falls again on June 12th in higher elevations of Vermont and New Hampshire. Witness accounts describe 6 to 7 inches of accumulation in some locations. This is documented in multiple independent sources. Newspapers from the period report it. Diaries confirm it. The snow in June is not legend. It happened. Europe experiences different manifestations of the same underlying problem. The cooling is global, but regional weather patterns vary. Europe receives not snow in summer, but cold and endless rain. In Germany, spring 1816 is cold and wet. Planting is delayed. When planting occurs, germination is poor. The cold, saturated soil prevents normal growth. Switzerland experiences similar conditions. Contemporary records from Geneva describe cold, wet weather beginning in May and persisting through summer. This is the weather that traps Byron, Shelley, and their companions at Villa Diodati. In France, the weather in spring 1816 is variable, but trending cold and wet. Some regions experience late frosts. Others simply experience below normal temperatures and excessive rain. The common factor is that normal agricultural cycles are disrupted. Britain experiences a cold, wet spring. Contemporary weather observations from London show temperatures below the historical average and precipitation significantly above average. The weather is not dramatically unusual by British standards, but the persistence is notable. Ireland, already suffering from structural economic problems, experiences cold, wet weather that worsens an already precarious food security situation. Irish agriculture in this period is heavily dependent on potatoes. The potato crop in 1816 shows early signs of stress from the cold, wet conditions. In Asia, the mechanisms are different, but outcomes similar. The volcanic aerosols disrupt atmospheric circulation patterns. The monsoons, on which Asian agriculture depends, arrive late or fail to arrive at normal strength. In India, the summer monsoon of 1816 is weak and irregular. Contemporary British East India Company records document unusual weather patterns. Some regions experience drought, others experience untimely flooding. The disruption of normal patterns is clear in the records. In China, Qing dynasty records document unusual weather in 1816. The precise nature varies by region, China being geographically vast, but the common pattern is disruption of normal agricultural conditions. Some provinces experience drought, others experience excessive rain. Crops fail across wide areas. By June 1816, the global nature of the crisis is becoming apparent to observers with access to international information, but most people experience it locally. A farmer in Vermont knows his crops are frozen. He does not know that Swiss farmers are experiencing crop failure due to cold rain. He does not know that Chinese farmers are dealing with disrupted monsoons. He experiences local disaster. The global pattern is invisible to him. Scientific observers begin noting the unusual weather, but without understanding cause. In Philadelphia, physician and scientist Samuel Mitchell observes the cold summer and begins collecting reports from correspondents. He will eventually propose a connection between volcanic eruptions and climate, but in June 1816, he is still gathering data. In England, scientist Luke Howard, who created the classification system for clouds that we still use, maintains detailed weather observations. He notes the unusual cold and wet conditions, but offers no explanation beyond natural variability. The scientific infrastructure to understand what is happening does not exist. There is no global network of weather observations. Temperature measurements are not standardized. Atmospheric science barely exists as a field. The concept that particles in the upper atmosphere could affect global climate has not been theorized. So the cold spreads through spring 1816. People experience it, record it, suffer from it, but do not understand it. And June, when summer should arrive, brings not warmth, but frost and snow. The crisis that began with spreading aerosols becomes manifest as failed crops and spreading hunger. The year without summer has begun. Chapter 3. When Summer Never Came. July 1816. The month when summer should peak, when heat should be intense, when crops should be growing vigorously toward autumn harvest. Instead, July brings continued cold. In New England, frost occurs on multiple nights. Contemporary records document frost in early July across Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. Gardens that survived June's freezes are killed in July. On July 9th, snow falls in Cabot, Vermont. This is documented in the journal of local resident Chauncey Jerome, a clockmaker. He records making a snowball on July 9th, 1816. Other contemporary accounts corroborate snow in Vermont and New Hampshire on or near this date. The psychological impact is profound. People in 1816 understand seasons. They know winter brings cold, summer brings warmth. This is natural order. When snow falls in July, it violates everything they understand about how the world works. A Vermont farmer named John Corse keeps a detailed journal. His entry for July shows temperatures barely reaching into the 50s Fahrenheit during the day, 40s at night. He records that neighbors are abandoning farms. Some are heading west to Ohio. Others are moving to cities. Everyone recognizes that without harvest, winter means starvation. In Maine, coastal areas experience somewhat less severe cold due to ocean moderation, but interior regions suffer dramatically. Contemporary newspaper accounts describe ice forming on ponds in July, trees damaged by frost, crops completely destroyed. The cold is not constant. Some days are warmer, but the pattern is unstable. A warm day is followed by frost. Plants that begin to grow are then killed. The inconsistency prevents adaptation. If the weather were consistently cold, farmers might adjust. But the variability defeats any strategy. Professor Jeremiah Day's temperature records from New Haven show July 1816 averaging approximately 5 degrees Fahrenheit below the long-term mean. This is significant cooling. Combined with the frequent frosts, agriculture becomes impossible. August should bring final growth before harvest. Instead, August brings more frost. In Maine, frost is recorded on August 21st. In Vermont, on August 23rd. These dates are a month earlier than normal frost dates. The growing season has been compressed from both ends. Late spring frost, early autumn frost. Nothing in between matured. Contemporary accounts describe the desperation, people harvesting immature corn to feed to livestock. The corn will not mature. Better to harvest it green than lose it to frost. But green corn has little nutritional value. The animals eat it but do not thrive. Some attempt to salvage what they can. They cut the frozen wheat and dry it for animal feed. They dig up potatoes that never grew large. They pick beans that never filled out. The harvest of 1816 in New England is catastrophic. Estimates suggest yields were 10 to 20% of normal. Some crops failed completely. In Europe, the manifestations differ, but outcomes converge. July 1816 is cold and wet. Germany experiences continuous rain. Crops do not mature in the waterlogged fields. Wheat rots before ripening. Grain that survives is poor quality. Switzerland's situation is desperate. The country is mountainous. Agricultural land is limited even in good years. 1816 sees crops fail across the cultivated regions. The Swiss diet depends heavily on grain and potatoes. Both fail. The Swiss government conducts surveys of food stores in July. The results are alarming. Grain reserves are low. The current harvest is clearly failing. The population cannot be fed through the coming winter without imports. But Switzerland is landlocked, surrounded by nations also experiencing crop failure. Where will imports come from? France experiences widespread crop failure. In Normandy, the wheat crop is devastated by cold and wet weather. In the south, results are marginally better, but still below normal. Grain prices begin climbing in July as the extent of the failure becomes apparent. In Paris, bread prices increase noticeably by late July. The urban poor, who spend the majority of their income on bread, begin to suffer. Food riots occur sporadically. The government responds by deploying troops to protect bakeries and grain stores. Britain's situation is complex. The wheat harvest is poor. But Britain has resources. The empire provides access to grain from around the world. The British government begins organising imports. Ships are dispatched to Baltic ports, to North Africa, to any source with grain to sell. This helps Britain, but it worsens the global situation. British purchasing power drives up grain prices internationally. Nations with less purchasing power are outbid. The grain flows to those who can pay, not to where need is greatest. Ireland experiences catastrophe compounding existing misery. Irish agriculture in 1816 is structurally exploitative. Tenant farmers grow grain on land owned by absentee English landlords. The grain is sold for export regardless of local need. The tenants survive on potatoes. In 1816, both grain and potatoes are affected by the cold, wet weather. Yields are poor, but the grain export continues. Irish grain ships to England, while Irish people begin to starve. This is not accident. This is policy. Property rights take precedence over preventing famine. Contemporary accounts from Ireland describe conditions deteriorating through the summer. Families eating nettles, seaweed, anything with calories. The weakest begin dying, the very young, the elderly, those already malnourished. In Asia, the monsoon failures create different crises. In India, regions dependent on monsoon rains for irrigation experience drought. Rice paddies dry up, crops wither. The British East India Company, which controls much of India, continues extracting grain for export despite local shortages. Profit matters more than preventing starvation. In China, the complex geography creates varied conditions. Some regions flood, others experience drought. The common factor is disruption of normal patterns. Chinese agriculture in this period is sophisticated and generally resilient, but 1816 tests that resilience. Qing dynasty records show grain prices rising across the empire through the summer of 1816. The government opens imperial granaries in some regions, releasing stored grain to stabilize prices. This helps. It does not solve the problem. The harvest is failing. Reserves are finite. By late August 1816, the global scope is clear to anyone with access to international information. crop failures are occurring across the Northern Hemisphere. From New England to Europe to Asia, the pattern repeats. Different mechanisms. Same result. Famine is coming. The people experiencing it still do not understand why. The connection to Tambora will not be established for years. They know only that nature has broken, that summer failed, that winter is approaching and there is no harvest to sustain them through it. August ends. September begins. Harvest season in name, but there is almost nothing to harvest. The year without summer transitions into the year without food, and the dying begins. Chapter 4. Famine spreads. September 1816, harvest month. Farmers across New England walk through fields of failure. The corn stands in rows, but the ears never filled. The stalks are blackened by repeated frosts. The wheat that was planted never matured. Gardens produced almost nothing. Some attempt to salvage what exists. They harvest the immature corn, feed it to livestock. The animals eat, but the nutritional value is poor. Milk production drops. Cattle begin losing weight. Without adequate feed, animals cannot survive winter. Farmers face brutal calculations. Slaughter animals now before they lose more weight. Preserve the meat for winter. But slaughtering breeding stock means no animals for spring planting. No milk for the family. The choice is between immediate food and future viability. Most choose to slaughter. The calculation is simple. Better to have food now than to watch animals starve slowly while producing nothing. At least butchered animals provide calories. But this creates secondary problems. Everyone is slaughtering at once. Meat prices collapse temporarily due to oversupply. There is no money to buy necessities. And the mass slaughter eliminates breeding stock needed for agricultural recovery. The situation in cities is different but equally desperate. Urban populations do not grow food. They depend on purchasing it. When harvests fail and prices rise, city dwellers cannot eat. In Boston, grain prices in September 1816 are documented at double the previous year's levels. In New York, similar increases. By October, prices are triple normal. The urban poor are priced out of eating. Contemporary newspaper accounts describe the situation. In the Boston Daily Advertiser, October 1816, articles discuss the severe shortage and rising prices. Charity organizations are forming. Churches organize relief. But the scale of need exceeds charitable capacity. Migration begins in earnest in September. Families that decided to stay through summer, hoping for some harvest, now recognize there will be none. They pack what they can carry and leave. The migration from New England is substantial. Contemporary accounts describe roads crowded with families heading west, to New York State, to Pennsylvania, to the Ohio Territory, anywhere that might have better conditions. These migrants are not wealthy. They cannot afford to transport much. They walk. They take what they can carry. They abandon farms that families worked for generations, houses, barns, cleared fields, all left behind. The migration is documented in population records. Vermont's population declines between the census of 1810 and 1820. New Hampshire similarly loses population. Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois gain population substantially. The year without summer accelerates westward expansion. But not everyone can leave. The poor lack resources for migration. The elderly cannot make the journey. Those with no networks in the West have nowhere to go. They stay, and they suffer. Winter, 1816 to 1817, is severe, not just because of continued volcanic cooling. Europe experiences what meteorologists would now call a blocking pattern. High-pressure systems stall, trapping cold air over the continent for extended periods. In Britain, the Thames freezes solid in January 1817. This has occurred before. The last major freeze was in 1814, but 1817's freeze is severe and prolonged. ice thick enough for people to walk across, for merchants to set up booths. Frost fairs occur. These fairs are documented. Prints from the period show them. Contemporary accounts describe them. People walking on the frozen Thames, entertainment on the ice. But this occurs while people starve nearby. The juxtaposition is jarring. The British government recognises the crisis. Parliament debates relief measures. The Corn Laws, which restrict grain imports to protect domestic producers, are temporarily relaxed. This allows increased imports. Britain imports grain from wherever it is available, from Russia, from the Baltic states, from North Africa. British purchasing power and naval strength secure supply. This helps Britain, but it drives up global prices and worsens scarcity elsewhere. France experiences political crisis compounding hunger. The restored Bourbon monarchy is unstable. Louis XVIII faces legitimacy questions. The failed harvest and rising grain prices create opportunity for opposition. Food riots begin in autumn 1816 and escalate through winter. In Lyon, crowds attack grain stores in October. In Paris, bread riots occur in November. The government deploys troops. Some rioters are arrested. A few are executed as examples. The repression does not stop the unrest. It intensifies it. Hungry people have little left to lose. The threat of punishment matters less when the alternative is starvation. In Germany, the response varies by state. Prussia, the largest German state, organizes relatively effective relief. The government purchases grain abroad, distributes it through established administrative structures, maintains order. Smaller German states struggle. Limited resources, less administrative capacity. Some states experience near-total breakdown of order. In Württemberg, contemporary accounts describe widespread begging, criminal activity, desperation. Switzerland's situation is critical, landlocked, mountainous. Limited agricultural land. The government coordinates canton cooperation, organizes grain imports through considerable difficulty. The Swiss survive through organization and cooperation, but barely. Ireland experiences horror. The export of Irish grain continues even as Irish people starve. This is not oversight. This is how the system is designed. Irish tenant farmers grow grain for English landlords. The landlords sell it for profit. Where it goes is irrelevant to them. Contemporary accounts from Ireland describe mass starvation. In County Clare, a traveller describes seeing people eating grass. In Cork, charity workers report families too weak to leave their homes. The death toll climbs through the winter. Disease spreads among the weakened population. Typhus thrives in conditions of malnutrition, overcrowding, and poor sanitation. All three conditions exist in Ireland in winter 1816 to 17. The epidemic kills thousands. Parish death records from Ireland show dramatic increases in winter 1816 to 17. The exact death toll is difficult to establish. Record keeping was incomplete. Many deaths went unrecorded. But modern historians estimate tens of thousands of excess deaths in Ireland from the famine and related disease. In Asia, the crisis manifests differently, but with similar severity. In India, the monsoon failures of 1816 created drought in some regions. The winter crop season of 1816 to 17 is affected. British East India Company records document rising grain prices across India. Famine conditions develop in Bengal and other regions. The company continues extracting revenue despite local starvation. Colonial priorities outweigh preventing death. In China, the winter of 1816 to 17 is harsh. The Qing dynasty releases grain from imperial reserves in affected regions. This helps, but it is insufficient. Contemporary Chinese sources describe increased banditry, social disorder, the signs of systems under stress. As winter deepens, mortality increases across the northern hemisphere. The deaths are not always recorded as starvation. Doctors write fever or consumption or pneumonia, but the underlying cause is malnutrition weakening bodies that then succumb to disease. Contemporary sources describe the suffering. In Vermont, Reverend Samuel Williams writes in January 1817 of families dying in their homes. Bodies not discovered until spring because roads are impassable. In Switzerland, government surveys in February 1817 document villages where a significant portion of the population has died. The reports are clinical, list numbers. Do not dwell on the human suffering those numbers represent. In Germany, contemporary diarist notes from Baden describe seeing corpses on roads, people who died travelling, too weak to continue, too far from help. The winter of 1816 to 17 is long, cold, deadly. People burn whatever they can find for heat. Furniture, fences, any wood they can get. Fuel prices spike. The poor must choose between eating and heating. Many freeze. By March 1817, it is clear that an enormous number of people have died. The exact toll will never be precisely known. Deaths were scattered, records incomplete. But modern historical analysis estimates the global death toll from the year without summer and its aftermath at approximately 100,000, possibly more. These deaths were not distributed equally. The poor died, the wealthy survived. This was not random. This was structural. Those with resources purchased food at inflated prices. Those without resources starved. Ireland lost a higher percentage of population than Britain. India lost more than Britain. The colonial subjects died while the colonial powers survived by extracting resources from the colonies. Within nations, the rural poor died while urban wealthy survived. Tenants died while landlords survived. Labourers died while owners survived. The year without summer revealed and intensified existing inequality. Spring 1817 finally arrives. Weather begins normalizing, not immediately, not everywhere, but the volcanic aerosols are dissipating. Solar radiation is increasing. Temperatures rise toward normal. The crisis is not over. The agricultural cycle is broken. Seed stocks are depleted. Breeding animals were slaughtered. Farmers have no capital. The recovery will take years, but the acute phase is ending. The dying slows. Survivors emerge from the worst winter and see that spring has actually come this time. The sun brings warmth. The frost dates return to normal. Planting becomes possible. The year without summer is ending, but its consequences will persist for generations. Chapter 5. Social upheaval. The order breaks. Famine does not just kill bodies. It kills social order. When people cannot eat, every other concern becomes secondary. Law, custom, the bonds that hold society together, all strain under the pressure of survival. In France, the food riots that began in autumn 1816 escalate through winter into spring 1817. What starts as bread riots becomes something more organized, more political, more threatening. In Lyon, France's second largest city, riots in March 1817 forced the local government to flee temporarily. Crowds take control of grain stores, distribute food themselves. This is not mere riot. This is insurrection. The national government responds with military force. Troops are dispatched. Order is restored through violence. Some rioters are executed publicly as examples. But the underlying problem remains. The people are hungry. Repression does not create food. Contemporary French police reports describe the situation. These documents, preserved in French archives, show the government's awareness of how close the situation comes to revolution. The memory of 1789 is fresh. Everyone knows that hunger sparked that revolution. Louis XVIII's government increases grain imports. relaxes price controls, attempts to satisfy demands without surrendering authority. This partially succeeds, but the political damage is done. The monarchy has shown its fragility. Opposition groups have learned that disorder creates leverage. In Britain, the response to potential unrest is preemptive repression. The government fears that returning soldiers from the Napoleonic Wars, now unemployed and hungry, will revolt. In March 1817, Parliament passes the Seditious Meetings Act. This restricts public gatherings. Meetings of more than 50 people require magistrate approval. Political assembly becomes difficult and dangerous. The same month, Parliament suspends habeas corpus. This allows authorities to imprison people without trial or charge. The suspension is framed as temporary emergency measure. It lasts more than a year. These measures target reformers and radicals. Anyone advocating political change can be arrested. The government argues this is necessary to prevent insurrection. Critics argue it is tyranny using crisis as excuse. The repression radicalizes moderates. People who might have accepted gradual reform now see the government as enemy. The reformers who are imprisoned become martyrs. Their imprisonment proves the need for reform. Contemporary radical newspapers like The Black Dwarf, published by Thomas Jonathan Wooler, document the repression. The government prosecutes Wooler for seditious libel. He is acquitted by jury. The trial makes him famous. His newspaper's circulation increases. The tensions created in 1816 and 17 will explode later. The Peterloo Massacre of August 1819, where cavalry charge a peaceful reform meeting in Manchester and kill 15 people, has direct roots in the repression of 1817. The protesters at Peterloo are demanding parliamentary reform and repeal of the Corn Laws. Their anger comes from watching grain exported while they starved in 1816. The repression they experienced in 1817 taught them the government will use violence against them. In Germany, the fragmented political structure creates varied responses. Prussia maintains order through combination of effective relief and military presence. The Prussian government organizes grain imports, distributes food relatively efficiently, shows administrative competence. This strengthens Prussia's argument for German unification under Prussian leadership. The crisis demonstrates that small states cannot manage large problems. That coordination requires central authority. These arguments will eventually lead to German unification in 1871. Smaller German states struggle with both hunger and disorder. In Württemberg, government records from 1817 document increasing crime, theft particularly. Starving people steal food. Courts face impossible situations. Should a man who stole bread to feed his children be punished? Legally, theft is theft, but morally, letting children starve while grain sits in guarded stores seems wrong. Judges struggle. Verdicts vary. There is no good answer. Contemporary German court records show this tension. Some judges are lenient. Others enforce law strictly. The inconsistency creates perception of arbitrary justice. This undermines legal authority. Switzerland survives through cooperation. The crisis forced the cantons to work together. They coordinated relief efforts, shared resources, created joint policies. This cooperation becomes institutionalized. The Swiss Confederation had been a loose association of independent states. The 1816 crisis makes coordination necessary. The systems created for managing famine become permanent structures. Modern Switzerland's federal system has roots partly in the necessity created by the year without summer. Ireland's experience is different. The famine creates rage, not at nature. Nature is impersonal. The rage is directed at the British government that allowed Irish grain export while Irish people starved. Daniel O'Connell, Irish political leader, uses the famine in his arguments for rights and reform. He points to the deaths, argues that the system is designed against Irish interests. that British rule serves British profit at Irish expense. Contemporary speeches and writings by O'Connell reference the famine. He is building the case for Irish self-governance. The Year Without Summer provides evidence, proof that the British government values property rights more than preventing starvation. This argument resonates. The famine of 1816 is not the Great Famine of the 1840s. That will be far worse. But it is preview. It shows the pattern. British structural priorities made manifest. Social cohesion breaks differently in different communities. Some communities strengthen. The crisis creates solidarity. Neighbours help each other. Resources are shared. These communities emerge more cohesive. Contemporary accounts from New England describe communities where the church organised relief, where wealthier farmers helped poorer ones, where the community survived through cooperation. These places remember the crisis as time when the community came together. Other communities fracture, trust breaks, cooperation fails, everyone hoards, everyone competes for scarce resources. These communities suffer more during the crisis and emerge weaker afterward. The difference is social capital, communities with strong institutions, relationships of trust, habits of cooperation survive better. Communities without these assets struggle more, even if they have equal material resources. The Year Without Summer becomes social experiment, revealing which communities have genuine solidarity versus those that only appeared cohesive during easier times. Stress reveals truth. Crime increases across affected regions. Theft of food is most common, but other crimes increase too. Violence, assault. Desperate people become dangerous people. Contemporary crime statistics from multiple regions show increases in 1816 and 1817. London's Old Bailey Court records show increased prosecutions. German court records show similar patterns. The crisis makes people criminal. The social impact of the crisis is visible in marriage and birth records. Marriages decline in 1816 and 17. People delay marriage because they cannot afford to support families. Birth rates decline 9 months after the hunger peaks. These demographic effects are documented in parish records across Europe and America. The Year Without Summer leaves visible mark in population statistics, a gap, a missing cohort. Migration creates social disruption in receiving areas. Ohio, Indiana, Illinois receive floods of New England migrants. These newcomers need land. They compete with existing settlers. Tensions develop. Native American tribes face displacement pressure. The migrants need land. The government is willing to take it from tribes. The Year Without Summer accelerates the dispossession that is American expansion. Contemporary treaties from this period show the pattern. Tribes cede land under pressure. The migrants who fled famine in Vermont become settlers, displacing native peoples in Indiana. Disaster in one place becomes disaster for others. The social upheaval is not temporary. It reshapes politics, demographics, community structures. The Year Without Summer changes society. Some changes are visible immediately. Others unfold over decades. But the common pattern is clear. When civilization is stressed, existing inequalities determine outcomes. Power determines who suffers. The poor die, the powerful survive, and society reorganizes around that reality. Chapter 6. The Artist's Response. Darkness Made Beautiful. Villa Diodati, Lake Geneva, Switzerland, June 1816. Lord Byron rents the villa in May. He is 28 years old. Famous poet, scandalous reputation, fled England to escape debts and judgment. Switzerland offers exile with dignity. Percy Bysshe Shelley arrives shortly after. He is 23, poet, revolutionary thinker. Expelled from Oxford for publishing a pamphlet on religious doubt, he brings Mary Godwin, 18 years old, daughter of philosophers William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft. Percy and Mary are not yet married. Percy is still legally married to another woman, though they have separated. This makes them unwelcome in England. Switzerland offers refuge. Mary's stepsister, Claire Clairmont, is also present. She is involved with Byron, carrying his child, though Byron shows little interest in her. The arrangement is complicated and tense. Byron's personal physician, John Polidori, 20 years old, completes the group. He aspires to literary fame. Living in Byron's shadow both helps and frustrates this ambition. The weather in June 1816 is terrible. Cold, wet, perpetual grey. They cannot go boating on the lake, cannot hike in the mountains. The outdoor activities they planned are impossible. Byron describes the weather in letters, a wet, ungenial summer. His letters are preserved. We know his perceptions. The gloom was real, not retroactively imposed by later interpretation. Trapped indoors, they need entertainment. On June 16th, 1816, Byron proposes a competition. Each person will write a ghost story. This is documented. Mary Shelley writes about it in the 1831 Introduction to Frankenstein. The others produce stories quickly. Percy writes one, but does not complete it. Byron begins a story about a vampire. Polidori listens and will later develop this into the vampire. Mary struggles, cannot think of anything. Days pass. She listens to Byron and Percy discuss scientific topics. Galvanism, the experiments of Luigi Galvani and Giovanni Aldini using electricity to make dead tissue move, the philosophical implications of animating matter. On the night of June 17th or 18th, the exact date is uncertain, Mary has a waking vision. She describes it in the 1831 introduction. She sees the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he has created, the creature's yellow eye opening. She begins writing, the story that becomes Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus. The novel is saturated with the darkness of 1816. The Arctic setting where Victor Frankenstein pursues his creation through ice and snow mirrors the frozen summer outside Mary's window. The gloom, the cold, the sense of nature as hostile. The creature's isolation reflects the alienation of the famine year, cut off from normal human life, existing in conditions that feel fundamentally wrong. The creature's rage at his creator parallels rage at whatever force has broken the world. Mary does not know about Tambora. The connection will not be established for years. But she is writing during its effects. The volcanic winter seeps into her prose without her awareness. She completes a short version by late summer, will expand it into full novel over the next year. It is published anonymously in 1818. The book is attributed to Percy Shelley initially. Mary's authorship is not publicly acknowledged until the 1831 edition. The novel becomes culturally foundational. The story about creation, responsibility, and consequences resonates across centuries. Partially because it emerged from genuine darkness. From the summer that was not summer, Byron is also writing. His poem Darkness is composed in summer 1816. The exact composition date is uncertain, but it is written during the cold, gloomy summer. The poem imagines the sun extinguished. Perpetual night. Humanity desperate for warmth and light. Civilization collapsing. Eventual extinction. I had a dream, which was not all a dream. The bright sun was extinguished, and the stars did wander darkling in the eternal space, rayless and pathless, and the icy earth swung blind and blackening in the moonless air. This is not pure fantasy. Byron is describing what he sees, the dim sun, the heavy clouds, the unseasonable cold. He extrapolates to apocalypse, creates poetry from catastrophe. The poem continues through visions of humanity's end, people burning everything for light and warmth, famine, war over resources, final extinction. It is dark, hopeless, powerful. Byron writes this while it snows in June, while crops die, while people starve. He is not inventing horror. He is documenting it through artistic vision. Polidori writes The Vampire, published in April 1819 in New Monthly magazine. It is attributed to Byron initially, which angers Polidori, but it is his work. The story features Lord Ruthven, an aristocratic vampire who preys on innocent people while maintaining cultured facade. This becomes template for vampire literature. Sophisticated monster rather than folklore creature. The vampire as aristocrat who drains others is metaphor. Polidori sees the wealthy surviving while the poor die, sees resources concentrated in few hands while masses starve, creates monster embodying that exploitation. All three works, Frankenstein, Darkness, and The Vampire, emerge from the villa during the summer that was not summer. The cold, gloomy days of June 1816 produce works that define literature for the next 2 centuries. But they are not alone. Across Europe and America, artists respond to the crisis. German painter Caspar David Friedrich was already working in Romantic style. His paintings show sublime landscapes, nature that inspires awe. But after 1816, the work becomes darker. His painting The Sea of Ice, also titled The Wreck of Hope, painted in 1823 to 1824, shows Arctic landscape crushing a ship, massive ice slabs overwhelming human endeavour. The painting was inspired by Arctic expeditions, but the emotional tone comes from 1816, from experience of nature as destroyer. Friedrich's work from the period shows increased desolation, ruins, ice, figures dwarfed by hostile nature. The paintings document the shift in perception. Nature is not benevolent. Nature kills. British painter J.M.W. Turner's work during and after 1816 shows unusual atmospheric effects, vivid red and orange skies. These are the aerosols from Tambora, creating spectacular sunsets. Turner paints what he sees. His work is later criticized as unrealistic, too colorful, too dramatic. But he is painting actual atmospheric conditions. The aerosols really did create those colors. His paintings are scientific documentation disguised as art. Turner's work from this period shows lurid sunset colors that were real atmospheric phenomena caused by volcanic particles. In literature, the darker mode that was popular entertainment becomes more serious, more philosophical. The darkness feels less like fantasy and more like reality. John Keats writes La Belle Dame sans Merci in 1819. A knight encounters a beautiful woman. She leaves him alone and palely loitering. The poem describes pale kings and princes too, pale warriors, death. Pale were they all. The pallor of famine victims is in the language even if not explicitly mentioned. The cold wandering, the failed harvest. It resonates with recent memory. Folk songs from the period across cultures share themes. Darkness, cold, hunger, lost harvests. These songs preserve memory in oral tradition, passed down through generations. In Vermont, the folk song 1800 and Froze to Death emerges from the year without summer. The song is documented in later folk music collections. The title alone preserves the memory. The artistic response matters because art preserves emotional truth that statistics cannot. Government reports list grain prices and death counts. Art captures what it felt like. The fear, the disorientation, the sense of broken world. Mary Shelley's vision of creation in darkness was not arbitrary. She was writing in a year when every creation seemed futile, when planting crops meant watching them freeze, when bringing children into the world meant uncertainty of survival. The monster's rejection by society mirrors the breakdown of social bonds, when community becomes competition for resources, when people are abandoned to struggle alone. This was not abstract philosophy. This was lived experience. Byron's darkness imagines extinction, but also documents survival instinct. People burning everything for warmth. This happened. Byron heard reports or saw it himself. The poem is testimony. The art created during 1816 becomes more valuable because it was created during crisis. The artists were not imagining apocalypse. They were living through version of it. When we read Frankenstein now, we read it as Gothic horror, science fiction, philosophical inquiry, all accurate, but we should also read it as testimony, evidence of what the year without summer felt like to someone experiencing it. The darkness Mary Shelley wrote into her novel was not metaphorical, it was meteorological. The gloom pervading the narrative was the gloom outside her window in June when it should have been bright. Art preserves what official records miss: the subjective experience of disaster, the emotional reality, the psychological impact that persists after material conditions improve. The year without summer created enduring art because the art captured something true about human response to catastrophe. The fear, the creativity emerging from constraint, the darkness transformed into beauty. Chapter 7. Scientific confusion. Why didn't they understand? The question seems obvious from our perspective. Why didn't scientists in 1816 understand the connection between Tambora's eruption and the cold summer? The eruption occurred in April 1815. The cooling began in 1816. The pattern seems clear, but it was not clear. Not for decades. Understanding why requires understanding the state of science in 1816. First, communications were slow. News of Tambora's eruption reached British newspapers in August 1815, 4 months after the event. The Times of London published a brief report on August 10, 1815, describing a volcano in the island of Sumbawa that had caused dreadful ravages. The report described local destruction, thousands of deaths, ash fall on neighbouring islands. But it characterised this as a local disaster. There was no suggestion of wider consequences. No framework existed for understanding that an Indonesian eruption could affect global climate. European and American readers had no reason to connect a distant volcanic eruption to their weather. Volcanoes were understood as local phenomena. The idea that volcanic material could enter the stratosphere and circle the globe, affecting climate worldwide, had not been theorized. Second, climatology did not exist as a science in 1816. The word climatology would not be coined until later in the century. The concept of climate as a global system that could be studied scientifically was only beginning to emerge. Weather observation existed, temperature measurements were taken, but these were scattered and unsystematic. No global network connected observations. Each observer worked independently. There was no infrastructure for recognizing global patterns. A scientist in London maintaining temperature records knew that London's temperatures in 1816 were unusually low, but he had no way of knowing whether Paris, Berlin, Vienna, or Moscow were experiencing similar anomalies. He could not know the cooling was hemispheric. Some scientific correspondence existed. Letters were exchanged between scientists in different countries, but this was informal, slow, incomplete, not adequate for recognizing synchronized global events. Third, the atmosphere was poorly understood. Scientists knew that air surrounded Earth. They knew the basic composition: nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, water vapor. But atmospheric physics barely existed as a field. The stratosphere was unknown. Scientists observed that temperature decreased with altitude in the lower atmosphere. But the stratosphere, where temperature increases with altitude, was beyond reach of instruments and theory. Balloons could not reach stratospheric heights. The highest balloon ascent by 1816 was approximately 7 kilometers. The stratosphere begins at roughly 10 kilometers. The region where Tambura's aerosols resided was inaccessible. Aerosols and their radiative effects were completely unknown. The concept that microscopic particles suspended in the atmosphere could reflect sunlight and cool Earth's surface had not been imagined. The optical physics required to understand this would not be developed until mid-century. Fourth, geology was still developing as a science. The age of Earth was disputed. Some scientists accepted biblical calculations. Others, following James Hutton, argued for vastly longer timescales based on geological evidence. Volcanic processes were mysterious. Scientists knew volcanoes released underground heat and gases. But why eruptions occurred, what drove them, why they existed in specific locations, all this was unknown. The connection between volcanic eruptions and climate had been proposed. Benjamin Franklin, in May 1784, wrote about the Laki eruption in Iceland. He noted that the summer of 1783 had been unusually cold. He observed a constant fog over all Europe and great part of North America. Franklin proposed this fog might have been caused by the eruption of a volcano in Iceland and might have affected the rays of the sun. This was perceptive, correct, but it was not widely accepted. Franklin's suggestion was published in Meteorological Imaginations and Conjectures in the Memoirs of the Literary and Philosophical Society of Manchester. The title itself suggests it was considered speculative rather than established fact. Fifth, the data that would have revealed the pattern was not being systematically collected. No one measured solar radiation. No one tracked atmospheric transparency. No one maintained coordinated global temperature records. Individual scientists kept weather journals. Professor Jeremiah Day at Yale, Thomas Jefferson at Monticello, Timothy Dwight in New Haven. These records are valuable to historians, but they were not coordinated at the time. Different instruments, different observation times, different recording methods. Comparing historical temperature records is difficult, even with modern statistical methods. At the time, it was impossible. Each observer had local data. No one had global perspective. Sixth, alternative explanations existed that fit within accepted scientific frameworks. Sunspot activity varied. Some scientists attributed climatic changes to solar variability. This was not unreasonable. The sun is the source of Earth's heat. If solar output varies, climate should vary. The problem is that sunspot activity is difficult to correlate with climate. The relationship exists, but is subtle. In 1816, claiming sunspots caused the cold was wrong, but not obviously so. The correct explanation, volcanic aerosols in the stratosphere affecting global radiation balance, required knowledge that did not exist in 1816. The necessary atmospheric physics would be developed over the following decades. The connection could not be established with available theory and data. So who eventually made the connection? Samuel Latham Mitchell, American physician and scientist, proposed volcanic causation in 1817. Mitchell was polymath, physician, chemist, naturalist, politician. He served in both House and Senate while pursuing scientific work. In December 1817, Mitchell read a paper to the American Philosophical Society arguing that volcanic eruptions could inject material into the upper atmosphere where it would persist and affect climate. Mitchell's paper was published in the Transactions of the American Philosophical Society in 1818. He was correct, but his argument was largely ignored. The evidence was circumstantial. The mechanism was unclear. Other scientists did not accept his conclusion. The connection between volcanic eruptions and climate cooling was gradually established through the middle decades of the 19th century. Multiple scientists contributed. Observations of atmospheric effects after eruptions, development of atmospheric physics, growing understanding of radiation and aerosols. By the late 1800s, the volcanic explanation for 1816 was accepted. But this was decades late. Too late to help people experiencing the catastrophe. For people living through 1816, the experience was of inexplicable disaster. Summer had failed. No one could explain why. This uncertainty amplified the terror. The disaster was bad enough. But not knowing the cause made it worse. Not knowing whether it would end. Not knowing if this was new, permanent condition or temporary aberration. Not knowing if human actions might help or were irrelevant. Humans need explanations. When scientific explanation is unavailable, other explanations emerge. Religious leaders attributed the cold to divine judgment, punishment for wrongdoing, warning of end times. These explanations were wrong, but served psychological need. Some attributed the weather to political causes. The Napoleonic Wars had recently ended. Perhaps the wars had disrupted natural order. Perhaps peace had not yet allowed nature to heal. These explanations were comforting because they suggested human action might help. The scientific confusion surrounding 1816 teaches important lessons about relationship between knowledge and disaster response. We cannot respond effectively to what we do not understand, but we must respond even when understanding is incomplete. The people of 1816 did respond. They organized relief. They migrated. They adapted. They did what they could with a limited understanding. Some responses were effective, others were not, but all were constrained by not knowing what they were dealing with. Modern science learned from this history. We now monitor volcanic eruptions globally, track aerosol dispersion, model climate impacts. When major eruption occurs, we can predict cooling effects. We can prepare. We cannot prevent eruptions. Nature remains beyond our control in this. But we can reduce impact through knowledge, through understanding mechanisms, through preparation based on that understanding. 1816 occurred in the darkness of ignorance. The catastrophe proceeded while scientists watched helplessly, unable to explain, unable to predict duration, unable to offer solutions beyond general adaptation. This powerlessness shaped how the disaster was experienced. The fear was not just of hunger. It was of forces beyond human comprehension, of world no longer following known rules, of nature as fundamentally alien and hostile. When science eventually explained 1816, the explanation brought both relief and concern. Relief because the mystery was solved. Understanding replaced confusion, but concern because the explanation revealed vulnerability. If one volcano could do this, others could too. Larger eruptions were possible. Such eruptions had occurred in the geological past. These were orders of magnitude larger than Tambora. Such eruptions would cause catastrophe, making 1816 look mild. Years-long volcanic winter, global crop failures, potential civilization collapse, and humanity remained helpless against such events. Understanding the mechanism did not provide ability to prevent or control. Nature's power remained beyond human capacity to resist. The scientific confusion of 1816 ended. Knowledge advanced, but vulnerability remained. That lesson persists. Chapter 8. Global Impacts. The Catastrophe Compared. The year without summer affected the entire Northern Hemisphere, but effects varied dramatically by region. Understanding these variations reveals the factors determining disaster outcomes. The United States in 1816 was young, 40 years since independence. The population was approximately 8,300,000, according to the 1810 census. The next census in 1820 would show 9,600,000. The growth rate was affected by 1816. New England bore the brunt of North American impact. The region was agricultural. The growing season was short, even in normal years. Frost-free period of perhaps 120 to 140 days. depending on location. 1816 compressed this to near zero in many locations. The frost on June 9th killed early plantings. Snow on June 12th destroyed what survived. July and August brought additional frosts. Nothing reached maturity. Contemporary accounts document the catastrophe. In Danville, Vermont, Reverend Samuel Williams kept detailed records. He documented frost in every summer month, total crop failure, families leaving for Ohio. In Williamstown, Massachusetts, Chester Dewey recorded temperatures. His measurements showed June 1816 averaging approximately 12 degrees Fahrenheit, below the long-term mean. July was similarly depressed. August showed some warming but still below normal with frequent frost. The human response was migration. People left New England in substantial numbers. Vermont's population in 1810 was 217,000. In 1820, it was 236,000. This represents growth of only 8% over 10 years. The national growth rate in this period was 33%. Vermont was losing people in relative terms. New Hampshire showed similar pattern. 214,000 in 1810, 244,000 in 1820. 14% growth against 33% national average. These people went west. Ohio's population in 1810 was 230,000. In 1820, 581,000. This is 152% growth. Indiana went from 25,000 to 147,000. 488% growth. Some of this western growth would have occurred regardless. Westward expansion was ongoing, but 1816 accelerated it dramatically. Contemporary accounts describe roads crowded with migrants fleeing the famine. The migration had lasting consequences. It changed American demography, shifted political power, spread settlement into territories that would become states. The shape of America was partly determined by people fleeing frozen crops in Vermont. But not everyone could migrate. The poor lacked resources for the journey. Those without networks in the West had nowhere to go. They stayed and suffered. Mortality increased. Exact numbers are impossible to establish. Death registration was incomplete, but parish records and cemetery records show increased burials in winter 1816 to 17. In some New England towns, winter mortality was 20 to 30% above normal. The deaths were recorded as various diseases: pneumonia, consumption, fever. But underlying cause was malnutrition. Bodies weakened by hunger succumbing to illnesses they might otherwise have survived. Europe in 1816 was recovering from the Napoleonic Wars. 2 decades of continent-wide conflict had ended in 1815. Infrastructure was damaged, economies disrupted, agricultural labor reduced by war casualties. The harvest failure of 1816 hit a region already vulnerable. Food security was marginal. Governmental capacity was stretched. The combination created catastrophe. But Europe was also more densely populated than America, more urbanized, with established institutions. The response varied by nation and revealed different governmental capacities. Britain had advantages. The empire provided access to global grain markets. The navy could secure shipping. The government had administrative capacity to organize imports and distribution. British grain imports increased dramatically in 1816. Ships were dispatched to Baltic ports, to North Africa, to any source with grain to sell. This helped Britain but drove up global prices. The British response was mixed success. Urban populations were largely saved from starvation through imports and relief programs. But the cost was borne by the poor through high prices and by colonial subjects through extraction. Contemporary British government documents record the response. Treasury papers show expenditure on grain imports. Relief records show increased payments. The administrative machinery functioned. not perfectly but adequately to prevent mass starvation in Britain itself. France faced political complications. The restored Bourbon monarchy under Louis XVIII was unpopular. The harvest failure created political opportunity for opposition. Food riots began in autumn 1816. Lyon, Toulouse, Paris all experienced unrest. The government responded with military force and limited concessions. Grain imports increased. Price controls were implemented temporarily, but repression was primary response. French records from the period document the government's concern about revolution. The memory of 1789 was fresh. Hunger had sparked that revolution. The government feared repetition. The political instability created by 1816 contributed to revolutionary movements that would explode in 1830 and 1848. The regime's response to the hunger crisis demonstrated its character. People remembered. Germany, not yet unified, responded according to each state's capacity. Prussia organized effectively. The government purchased grain abroad, distributed through established administrative structures, maintained order. Prussian efficiency in the crisis was noted. It strengthened arguments for Prussian leadership in eventual German unification. The crisis demonstrated that strong, centralized administration could manage what fragmented small states could not. Smaller German states struggled. Württemberg, Baden, Bavaria lacked resources and administrative reach. Some experienced near collapse of civil order. Contemporary accounts describe widespread begging, increased crime, social breakdown. Switzerland survived through cooperation. The Swiss cantons had historically guarded independence. But the crisis was too large for individual cantons. They coordinated, shared resources, created joint policies. This cooperation was formalized. The crisis created institutions and habits of coordination that strengthened the Swiss Confederation. Modern Swiss federalism has roots partly in necessity created by 1816. Ireland experienced horror. The structural exploitation of Irish agriculture by British absentee landlords created conditions where famine was inevitable when harvest failed. Irish grain continued to be exported to Britain while Irish people starved. This was not oversight. This was how the system was designed. Tenant farmers grew grain for export. They survived on potatoes. In 1816, both failed. Contemporary accounts describe mass starvation. In County Clare, travellers reported seeing people eating grass and seaweed. In Cork, charity workers found families too weak to leave their homes. The death toll in Ireland is difficult to quantify precisely. Record keeping was incomplete. But modern historical analysis estimates tens of thousands of excess deaths. The catastrophe foreshadowed the Great Famine of the 1840s, which would kill approximately 1 million. Asia experienced different mechanisms, but similar outcomes. The volcanic aerosols did not just cool temperatures, they disrupted atmospheric circulation. Monsoon patterns failed or arrived wrong. India depended on monsoon rains. The summer monsoon typically arrives in June, brings rain that fills rivers and irrigation systems. Agriculture is timed to this pattern. In 1816, the monsoon was disrupted. Some regions experienced drought, others experienced unseasonal flooding. The normal pattern broke. British East India Company records document the agricultural crisis. Grain prices rose across India. Famine conditions developed in Bengal, Bihar, and other regions. The company response prioritized revenue extraction over preventing starvation. Land taxes were collected even when harvest failed. Grain was exported to maintain trade. Company profits took precedence over lives. The death toll in India from the 1816 crisis is unknown. The company did not systematically record deaths, but contemporary accounts describe widespread suffering. Modern estimates suggest hundreds of thousands of excess deaths across the subcontinent. China experienced complex regional variations. Some provinces had drought, others had flooding. The disrupted atmospheric circulation created chaotic weather patterns. Qing dynasty records document increased grain prices and government response. Imperial granaries were opened in affected regions. Grain reserves were distributed. This helped but was insufficient to prevent famine. Contemporary Chinese sources describe increased social disorder, banditry, migration, the signs of systems under stress. The exact death toll is unknown, but substantial. Japan maintained detailed records. The Tokugaku shogunate documented the crisis carefully. Cold summer, crop failures, famine, government response through rice distribution and price controls. Japanese historical records show 1816 as crisis year. The northern regions, Tohoku particularly, suffered severely. Contemporary estimates suggest tens of thousands of deaths from famine and related disease. Comparing impacts across regions reveals key factors determining outcomes. Climate baseline mattered. Regions with longer growing seasons had more margin. Tropical areas experienced disruption, but not the killing frosts that destroyed northern temperate agriculture completely. Economic structure mattered. Market economies versus subsistence agriculture. Market systems could import food, but also exported food despite local need. Colonial systems extracted from colonies to feed metropolitan populations. Political capacity mattered. Strong governments with administrative reach could organize relief. Prussia, Britain. Weak or fragmented governments could not. Small German states. Occupied or colonized regions. Social cohesion mattered. Communities with strong mutual support networks survived better. Switzerland. Some New England towns. Societies where individuals competed rather than cooperated suffered more. Resource availability mattered. Regions with grain reserves, access to imports, or alternative food sources had options. Britain's empire, Prussia's organisation, those dependent on single crops with no reserves had none. Geographic factors mattered. Coastal regions with ports could import. Britain, landlocked regions faced transport challenges. Switzerland, mountains created additional distribution obstacles. Population density mattered. Densely populated regions depleted resources faster. Urban areas particularly vulnerable. Sparsely populated regions like American frontier could spread demand. The comparison reveals that 1816 was not one disaster, but many disasters occurring simultaneously with a common cause. The volcanic cooling was global, but outcomes depended on local conditions. Some regions recovered quickly. Others took years. Some used the crisis to drive reforms. Others learned nothing and repeated mistakes in future famines. The year without summer tested societies, revealed which were resilient and which were fragile, which governments served their people and which served elite interests, which communities had genuine solidarity and which had only the appearance of cohesion. The test was not chosen, but the responses were, and those responses determined who survived and who did not. Chapter 9. Recovery and Adaptation. Spring, 1817, arrives with a difference that feels miraculous. Actual warmth. The sun brings heat that penetrates. Frost dates return to normal ranges. Planting becomes possible. In New England, farmers who survived the previous year approach spring with caution and hope mixed. They plant, but they maintain no illusions. They know now that nature can kill, that assumptions of predictability are dangerous. Temperature records from New Haven show April, 1817, near the long-term mean. May is normal. June brings summer weather, actual summer. The contrast with the previous year is dramatic. Professor Jeremiah Day's meticulous records document the return to normalcy. Where June 1816 averaged perhaps 50 degrees Fahrenheit with multiple frosts, June 1817 averages near 70 degrees with no frost. The difference is survival versus catastrophe. Crops planted in spring 1817 actually grow. The corn reaches maturity. The wheat fills out. Gardens produce. When autumn arrives, there is harvest. Not exceptional harvest, but normal. Normal feels like miracle after 1816. The psychological impact of normal weather cannot be overstated. For a year, people lived under the conviction that nature had fundamentally broken, that the world had changed permanently. When summer returned in 1817, it proved the disaster was temporary. But temporary is not the same as erased. The year without summer taught lessons that could not be unlearned. Everyone who lived through it knew now that nature could kill, that abundance could become scarcity instantly, that security was illusion, recovery was not automatic. The agricultural system had been disrupted. Farmers entered 1817 with depleted seed stocks. Many had slaughtered breeding animals. Capital was exhausted. Debt was substantial. Those who survived did so often by borrowing, to buy seed, to purchase food to survive the winter. Come spring, 1817, the debts were due. Successful harvest meant ability to repay, but it meant starting from zero. No reserves, no margin for future failure. Migration continued even as conditions improved. The decisions made during the crisis had momentum. Families who had decided to abandon New England followed through even when immediate crisis passed. The westward movement that accelerated in 1816 continued through 1817 and beyond. Ohio, Indiana, Illinois continued receiving migrants. New settlements were established. Towns were founded. The demographic shift was permanent. But adaptation occurred beyond migration. Farming practices changed. Farmers who had experience with 1816 diversified crops, relied less on single plantings, maintained larger reserves. The memory of 1816 made farmers conservative, risk-averse, cautious. They planted earlier when possible, chose faster maturing varieties when available, prepared for the possibility that summer might fail again. Agricultural technology advanced partly in response to the crisis. Research into frost-resistant crop varieties increased. The moldboard plough, which turned soil more effectively and improved drainage, was promoted after 1816 as method for reducing frost risk. Drainage became priority. Wet soils froze more readily. They also promoted root diseases. Investment in drainage increased. Tiles were laid in fields. Ditches were dug. The goal was removing excess water to improve yields and reduce frost vulnerability. Storage technology improved. Better grain silos reduced spoilage. Improved preservation methods allowed maintaining larger reserves. The goal was never being caught without food stores if another failure occurred. Governments adapted. Food security became explicit policy priority. Britain expanded grain reserve systems, created government-controlled stocks that could be released during price spikes. The British Corn Laws, which restricted grain imports to protect domestic producers, became subject of intense debate after 1816. The laws had prevented imports during the crisis, worsening shortages. Reformers argued for repeal. Landlords defended them. The debate would continue for decades, with repeal finally occurring in 1846. France reformed agricultural policy, encouraged crop diversification, invested in irrigation infrastructure, improved seed distribution systems. The goal was ensuring that single harvest failure would not create famine. Switzerland formalized the inter-canton cooperation developed during the crisis, created permanent institutions for disaster coordination, built roads to improve distribution between regions. The crisis revealed that isolation increased vulnerability, connection increased resilience. German states learned that coordination mattered. This fed into arguments for eventual unification. The crisis demonstrated that small states could not manage large problems effectively. That fragmentation created vulnerability. These arguments would culminate in German unification in 1871 under Prussian leadership. Economic institutions adapted. Insurance markets developed products covering crop failure. Farmers could purchase insurance against total loss. This spread risk, reduced individual vulnerability, made farming economically viable in marginal areas. Markets for grain became more sophisticated. Merchants could contract for future delivery at set prices. This provided price stability, reduced speculation, created mechanisms for managing risk. Banks developed lending products specific to agriculture, seasonal credit that aligned with planting and harvest cycles. This helped farmers manage cash flow, reduced vulnerability to single bad year. These financial innovations created more resilient food systems. When the next major climate disruption occurred, mechanisms existed to buffer impact. Markets could respond. Risk could be distributed. Individuals were not entirely alone against disaster. Social adaptation was complex and varied. Some communities emerged from the crisis stronger. The shared suffering created bonds, narratives of collective survival. These communities had demonstrated their social capital. They knew they could rely on each other. Other communities fragmented under the stress. Trust that broke during the crisis did not repair easily. These places struggled longer to recover socially even after economic recovery. Religious institutions had provided meaning during catastrophe. Organized charity offered hope when material conditions were hopeless. Many maintained their commitment after conditions improved. Cultural memory preserved 1816. In New England, the year became legendary. Multiple names emerged. The year without summer. 1800 and froze to death. The poverty year. These names persisted across generations. Folk songs commemorated the catastrophe. Stories were passed down in families. The collective memory became part of regional identity. Even people born after 1816 grew up knowing the story, knowing it could happen. In Europe, similar memorialization occurred. The year entered national historical consciousness, became reference point for discussing disaster and resilience. When later crises occurred, 1816 was comparison point. By 1818, material recovery was largely complete. Harvests in 1817 and 1818 were normal. Grain stores were refilled, prices stabilized, mortality returned to baseline levels. The volcanic aerosols had dissipated. Solar radiation reached Earth's surface normally. Temperature patterns were typical. The immediate physical cause of the crisis was gone. But psychological and social impacts persisted. Everyone who lived through 1816 carried the memory. This knowledge affected behavior, planning, risk calculation, relationship to nature and society. The assumption of stability that existed before 1816 could not be restored. People knew now that the world could change suddenly, that normal could become catastrophe overnight, that preparation mattered. This knowledge was valuable. It drove adaptation that increased resilience, but it also carried cost. The psychological burden of knowing, the constant awareness of vulnerability, the inability to return to innocence. Recovery meant something different than restoration. You cannot return to previous state after learning hard truths. The world after 1816 was not the world before. The physical landscape looked similar. The social institutions appeared the same. But the people were changed. They had learned what nature could do. They had learned which institutions and which communities could be trusted under pressure. That knowledge could not be forgotten. It shaped decisions for the rest of their lives. And it was passed down. to children, to grandchildren. The year without summer entered family law, became cautionary tale, became proof that assumptions of security were dangerous. The recovery from 1816 was successful in material terms. Food production returned to normal, population grew, economic activity resumed. By most measures, the crisis passed. But the experience could not pass. It was burned into memory, into culture, into the understanding of what was possible. The year without summer ended, but its lessons persisted. Chapter 10. Lasting changes. The world reshaped. The year without summer did not merely kill hundreds of thousands and traumatize millions. It fundamentally reshaped civilization in ways that persist to the present day. Before 1816, European agriculture remained largely medieval in practice. Three-field rotation was common, mixed farming, limited use of fertilizer, yields per acre were low, vulnerability to weather variation was high. 1816 demonstrated this vulnerability catastrophically. One failed season destroyed food security across multiple nations. The lesson was learned. Agricultural reform accelerated. The British agricultural revolution, already underway, intensified. The Norfolk four-course rotation became standard practice on progressive estates. Turnips and clover were cultivated not just as crops, but as soil improvers and fodder. This increased yields and reduced fallow requirements. Selective breeding advanced rapidly. Methods for sheep and cattle developed in the late 1700s spread more widely after 1816. Farmers who survived the famine often had better livestock or crop varieties. Their success demonstrated the value of selective breeding. Mechanization accelerated. The crisis demonstrated that labor-intensive agriculture was inefficient and vulnerable. Mechanical innovations spread faster. The seed drill, invented in the early 1700s, saw wider adoption. It allowed precise seed placement, reduced waste, improved germination rates. In an era of seed scarcity after 1816, efficiency mattered. The threshing machine spread more rapidly after 1816. Hand threshing was slow and labor-intensive. Mechanical threshing was faster and more thorough, reduced losses. Scientific agriculture emerged as discipline. Research into soil chemistry became systematic. Work on mineral nutrition of plants published in the 1840s had foundation in the recognition that agriculture needed scientific understanding. 1816 demonstrated the cost of ignorance. Agricultural societies formed to share knowledge. The Royal Agricultural Society of England was founded in 1838. Similar organisations formed across Europe. These societies promoted best practices, sponsored research, distributed new varieties, created networks for sharing innovation. The combination of better rotations, selective breeding, mechanisation, and scientific understanding transformed European agriculture. By mid-century, yields had increased substantially. Famines became less common and less severe. The system had adapted. The migration accelerated by 1816 changed nations permanently. In America, the westward shift of population reshaped the country. Ohio's population grew from 230,000 in 1810 to 581,000 in 1820 to 938,000 in 1830. Indiana went from 25,000 to 147,000 to 343,000 over the same period. This growth was not just natural increase, it was migration from the east, from New England particularly. The population of Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine grew slowly, while Western territories exploded. The new Western states changed American politics. They were agricultural, but not plantation-based. They were settled by small farmers. These states would form important political coalitions in coming decades. European migration to America increased. Germans fled crop failures and political instability. Irish fled famine and oppression. The 1820s through 1850s saw massive European immigration to America. This immigration created ethnic diversity that defined American culture. German and Irish communities in cities, their cultures, their politics, their religions, all shaped American development. Urbanization accelerated. People left marginal rural areas, moved to cities seeking wage labor. This created workforce for industrialization, provided labor for factories, changed Europe and America from rural to urban societies faster than might otherwise have occurred. The political impacts of 1816 unfolded over decades. The food riots and governmental responses shaped movements for change. The Corn Laws, which restricted grain imports, became symbol of exploitation. During 1816, grain prices were high. Domestic producers profited. Consumers starved. The Corn Laws prevented imports that could have relieved suffering. The campaign for repeal succeeded in 1846. The repeal was partly a result of sustained pressure built from the memory of 1816. Social welfare policy emerged partly from 1816. The recognition that governments needed disaster response capacity became accepted principle. Reform of relief systems acknowledged governmental responsibility for preventing starvation. The systems created were often harsh, but they acknowledged that government had a role in crisis management. In Germany, the crisis strengthened arguments for unification. Administrative capacity to manage crises became argument for centralized government. When German unification occurred under Prussian leadership in 1871, crisis management was one supporting argument. The crisis accelerated industrialization. Agricultural mechanization freed labor. Those workers moved to cities, provided workforce for factories. The Industrial Revolution was already occurring, but 1816 accelerated it. The demonstration that traditional agriculture was vulnerable drove investment in mechanization. The displaced rural workers staffed the factories. Transportation infrastructure improved. The demonstration that isolated regions could not survive during crisis drove investment in connection. Roads were built, canals were dug. The goal was moving food from surplus to deficit regions quickly. The Erie Canal, proposed before 1816, received funding partly because the crisis demonstrated need. When completed in 1825, it transformed American commerce. European railroad development accelerated for similar reasons. The first public railway, the Stockton and Darlington Railway in England, opened in 1825. Railroad expansion through the 1830s and 40s was driven partly by recognition that transportation infrastructure was critical for food security. Communication infrastructure improved. The crisis demonstrated that information about conditions elsewhere was valuable. Telegraph development was later, but the need it addressed was recognized during 1816. The failure to understand 1816 drove development of climatology as science. The recognition that climate needed systematic study led to infrastructure creation. Temperature record keeping became standardized. Networks of volunteer weather observers were organized in the 1840s and 50s. European nations created similar networks. The goal was collecting comparable data across regions. By mid-century, climate patterns could be analyzed globally. The data infrastructure existed to recognize global events. When the next major volcanic eruption occurred, scientists could track climate impacts. Volcanic impacts on climate were established as scientific fact. The connection between eruptions and cooling was recognized. Monitoring systems were created. By late 1800s, scientists could predict that major eruptions would cause cooling. The scientific advances were practical, driven by need to prevent repeat of 1816. Science that might have developed slowly was accelerated by catastrophe demonstrating its value. The art created during 1816 endured and influenced culture for centuries. Frankenstein became foundational text. The vampire literature launched continues to present day. These works were influential, not just as entertainment, but as serious examination of human relationship with nature and creation. They were taken seriously because they emerged from genuine crisis. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein became text studied widely, analysed for its treatment of creation, responsibility, and consequences. The novel's endurance comes partly from the authenticity of its darkness. It was written during actual catastrophe. The darker literary mode was strengthened by 1816. Made real, made serious. No longer mere entertainment, but examination of human vulnerability. Environmental awareness emerged slowly. The recognition that humans were vulnerable to natural forces. That civilization was fragile. These ideas took more than a century to develop, but they had seeds in the recognition that 1816 provided. Nature has power to disrupt civilization. Global trade increased. The crisis demonstrated that no region was self-sufficient. That international exchange was necessary for resilience. This drove expansion of trade networks, development of shipping infrastructure, creation of commodity markets. By mid-century, global grain trade was substantial. Regions specialized, traded, reduced local vulnerability through connection to global markets. But this created new vulnerabilities. Dependence on trade meant disruption of trade was catastrophic. Connection increased resilience against local shocks, but created vulnerability to system-wide shocks. Financial instruments for managing agricultural risk evolved. Credit systems, insurance, markets for risk transfer. These innovations made agriculture more stable, reduced individual exposure to catastrophe. 1816 taught lessons, but the lessons were not universally learned or applied. The pattern of climate disruption causing crop failure, causing famine, causing social upheaval repeated. The Irish Great Famine of 1845 to 1852 killed approximately 1 million people. It was caused by potato blight, but it was worsened by the same structural exploitation that made 1816 catastrophic in Ireland. Grain export continued while people starved. The pattern was clear. Climate variation happened. How societies responded determined death toll. Societies that learned from 1816 built resilience. Those that did not repeated the catastrophe at larger scale. The year without summer changed the world, created modern agricultural systems, drove migration that shaped nations, fed political movements, advanced science, shaped culture. The catastrophe was temporary, 1 year, but the changes were permanent. They defined the century that followed. They shaped the world we inherited, and the vulnerability revealed in 1816 remains. Nature retains power to disrupt civilization. Modern technology provides tools for adaptation, but it does not eliminate the fundamental reality. We remain dependent on agriculture, dependent on climate. 1816 teaches that vulnerability is permanent, that preparation matters, that social choices determine who survives and who does not, that nature is powerful beyond our control, that we adapt or we suffer. These lessons remain true. Epilogue. What 1816 teaches us. 210 years after Tambora exploded. 209 years after the summer that never came. We look back at 1816 not merely as history but as warning. Not as concluded catastrophe, but as preview of what remains possible. What did 1816 teach? What truths did that cold and hungry year reveal that remain true today? What lessons should we carry forward? We live in an age of technological mastery that would have seemed like magic to someone in 1816. We climate control buildings to maintain precise temperatures regardless of external weather. We illuminate darkness with artificial light. We communicate instantly across the globe. We fly through air. We have split atoms and visited the moon. This creates a dangerous illusion, the sense that we have conquered nature, transcended our vulnerability, become something beyond mere biological organisms subject to environmental conditions. 1816 reminds us this is illusion. One volcano destroyed that year's summer across an entire hemisphere. One geological event beyond any human influence or control killed hundreds of thousands, made the most powerful nations helpless, demonstrated that technology and organization cannot protect against natural forces operating on planetary scales. This lesson remains critical because we face similar challenges. Our modern systems depend on assumptions of stability, on predictable climate, on reliable growing seasons, on functioning supply chains. Tambora erupted. 60 million tons of sulfur dioxide entered the stratosphere. That material circled the globe for 3 years. Nothing humans could do would remove it. Technology in 1816 was inadequate, but even our modern technology would be limited against such events. If a larger eruption occurred, the global cooling would last years. Crop failures would be sustained. Billions would face starvation. Our technology would help. It would not prevent massive catastrophe. Nature operates on scales that dwarf human power. This was true in 1816. It remains true today. We have more tools for adaptation, but we do not have power to prevent or control the underlying natural processes. The proper response to this is not despair. It is realism. We should build resilience, prepare for shocks, create systems with redundancy and adaptability. Recognize that we will face disruptions, that nature retains power to harm us severely. 1816 teaches that assumptions of control are dangerous, that wise policy acknowledges limits, that preparation for events beyond our control is rational, not excessive. Before 1816, people assumed stability. Seasons came predictably. Harvests occurred. Food was available. These assumptions seemed reasonable. They were based on experience. Most years, they were correct. One year proved them wrong. The social order fractured quickly. Food riots emerged within months. Governments deployed military force against their own people. Communities that seemed cohesive dissolved into competition for scarce resources. The veneer of civilization proved thin. When people could not eat, law mattered less. Custom mattered less. The social contract eroded under pressure of immediate survival need. We make the same assumption now. We assume grocery stores will have food. That electricity will flow. That water will run from taps. That the systems sustaining us will continue functioning. Most people in developed nations are approximately 3 meals away from social chaos. The food system operates on days of inventory. Supply chain disruption causes immediate shortages. Modern civilization is complex, interconnected, efficient. These qualities create vulnerability. Complex systems fail catastrophically. Interconnection means disruption cascades. Efficiency means no redundancy. The just-in-time delivery systems that maximize profit minimize resilience. When disruption occurs, there are no reserves, no backup, no ability to weather shock. 1816 teaches that the systems we depend on can fail, that civilization is not solid foundation, but constant maintenance requiring energy and effort, that we should not assume persistence without attention. This argues for building resilience deliberately, maintaining reserves, creating redundancy, accepting the inefficiency cost of preparedness, because efficiency that fails catastrophically is not actually efficient. 1816 did not kill randomly. The wealthy survived. The poor died. This was not accident. This was structural. Rich people had food reserves, could afford higher prices, could purchase imports, could migrate if necessary, had options. The poor had none of these. When food became scarce, they starved. When prices rose, they could not pay. They were trapped by poverty in places experiencing catastrophe. In Ireland, grain was exported while Irish people starved. The landowners who owned the grain sold to highest bidder. That bidder was British. The transaction was legal, profitable, lethal to Irish poor who watched food leave while they died. In cities, the wealthy ate. The poor rioted for bread. Governments protected property, sent troops to guard grain stores, maintained the system that concentrated resources while people died. This pattern persists. Every major disaster reveals and worsens existing inequality. The wealthy adapt, the poor suffer. This is not natural. This is choice. We choose economic systems that concentrate resources. We choose policies that prioritize property over life. We choose not to build systems that would protect everyone. 1816 teaches that disaster is not equalizer, but amplifier. Existing inequalities determine outcomes. If we want different results in future catastrophes, we must address inequality before crisis arrives. This is not just moral argument, it is practical. Societies with high inequality are less resilient. Social cohesion matters for disaster response. Societies that abandon poor to die during crisis are weaker than societies that protect everyone. Compare Britain and Ireland in 1816. Both under same government, both experienced same failed harvest. Outcomes were vastly different. Britain organised grain imports, distributed food through relief systems, expanded programs. Death toll was significant, but not catastrophic. Social order was maintained. Recovery was relatively rapid. Ireland was allowed to starve while grain was exported. The government valued British interests, did not value Irish lives. Policy reflected these values. Outcomes followed. Tens of thousands of Irish died preventably. The difference was not natural, not geographic. It was political. The government chose who to save and who to let die. This pattern repeats in every disaster. Governmental capacity and choices determine survival rates. Competent government response saves lives. Incompetent or indifferent response kills. The difference is not the disaster. Same events affect all. The difference is response. Competence versus incompetence. Care versus indifference. Investment versus neglect. 1816 teaches that government is not abstract concept. It is difference between life and death, between managing disaster and being overwhelmed by it, between protecting people and abandoning them. But capacity is not just technical, it is political. Governments must choose to prioritize welfare, have adequate resources, build infrastructure before crisis, maintain institutions capable of responding. No one in 1816 understood they were living through volcanic winter. The science did not exist to explain it. They suffered without comprehending cause. This ignorance worsened the catastrophe, made it more frightening, prevented effective response. If they had known an eruption caused it, known it would end, known to prepare for future eruptions, response would have been different. Planning would have been possible. Instead of wondering if this was permanent new condition, they would have known to endure until aerosols dissipated. Instead of wondering why, they could have focused on adaptation. Science eventually explained 1816, but decades late. Too late to help the people who lived through it. The understanding came only after analyzing years of data, developing atmospheric physics, connecting evidence. We are better positioned now. We understand volcanic climate impacts. We monitor eruptions. We can model effects. When major eruption occurs, we can predict consequences with reasonable accuracy. But we face new challenges our science has not fully characterized. The interactions are complex. The tipping points are uncertain. We are conducting experiment with planetary systems without complete understanding of outcomes. 1816 teaches that understanding lags catastrophe. We learn by experience. The first occurrence of unprecedented event happens before science can predict it. We will face impacts we have not fully anticipated, will not completely understand until they occur. This argues for precaution, for building resilience against unknown risks, for humility about our understanding, for recognition that our models are incomplete. The proper response to uncertainty is not inaction. It is preparation for range of possibilities. Resilient systems can handle surprises. Systems optimized for specific scenarios fail when reality differs from projection. 1816 also teaches value of science. The understanding came eventually. Allowed prediction of future eruptions, enabled preparation. Science is how we transform mystery into knowledge, vulnerability into capability. 1816 was remembered, but imperfectly. The immediate survivors passed down stories. Those became family legends. Details were simplified. Emotion faded. The visceral reality became historical anecdote. By the time next major disruptions occurred, institutional memory had faded. Each felt unprecedented to those experiencing it. The lessons were available, in archives, in histories. But lived experience cannot be transmitted through text. Each generation must relearn through suffering what previous generations learned. This pattern continues. Each generation forgets lessons previous generations paid for. The knowledge exists, but it is not internalized, not acted upon, until crisis forces learning again. 1816 teaches that knowledge is not enough, that each generation must actively maintain preparedness, that institutional memory requires continuous effort, that forgetting is natural, remembering requires work. This argues for building memory into institutions, creating systems that do not depend on individual memory, maintaining infrastructure even when immediate threat seems absent, training new generations even when crisis seems distant. The question seems obvious from modern perspective. Why didn't people prepare better after 1816? They knew volcanic eruptions could cause climate disruption. They knew crop failures could cause famine. They knew social systems were fragile. But they returned to assumptions of normalcy, reduced reserves, dismantled emergency systems, forgot the lessons. When next major famine occurred, the Irish Great Famine of the 1840s, the mistakes were repeated. Export during starvation, inadequate relief, political indifference. 1 million died. The pattern from 1816 was repeated at larger scale, because memory had faded, because institutions had not maintained preparedness, because each generation thought it would not happen again. We make the same error. We know disasters occur. We know systems are fragile, but we reduce reserves, dismantle preparedness, assume it will not happen. 1816 teaches that this is a dangerous pattern. That preparation must be continuous. That memory must be actively maintained. That institutions must be sustained even when threat seems distant. The artistic response to 1816 matters because art preserves emotional truth that statistics cannot. Government reports list grain prices and death counts. Art captures what it felt like. The fear, the disorientation, the sense of broken world. Mary Shelley's vision of creation in darkness was not arbitrary. She was writing in a year when every creation seemed futile, when planting crops meant watching them freeze, when bringing children into the world meant uncertainty of survival. The monster's rejection by society mirrors the breakdown of social bonds. When community becomes competition for resources, when people are abandoned to struggle alone. This was not abstract philosophy. This was lived experience. Byron's poem Darkness imagines extinction, but also documents survival instinct. People burning everything for warmth. This happened. Byron heard reports or saw it himself. The poem is testimony. The art created during 1816 becomes more valuable because it was created during crisis. The artists were not imagining apocalypse. They were living through version of it. When we read Frankenstein now, we read it as fiction, entertainment, philosophy, all accurate. But we should also read it as testimony, evidence of what the year without summer felt like to someone experiencing it. Art preserves what official records miss. The subjective experience of disaster, the emotional reality, the psychological impact that persists after material conditions improve. 1816 teaches that we should preserve disaster through art as well as data. That future generations need both to truly understand that the subjective experience matters as much as the objective measurement. Individual action could not solve 1816. A farmer could not make summer arrive. A merchant could not create food that did not exist. Individual effort was insufficient. Collective action helped. Communities that cooperated survived better. Governments that organized response saved lives. International trade distributed scarce resources more effectively than isolated regions could. But collective action was inadequate. The crisis was larger than existing institutions. Coordination was insufficient. Resources were misallocated. Competition prevailed where cooperation was needed. 1816 teaches that problems requiring collective action only grow more urgent when ignored. That delaying cooperation increases eventual cost. That the alternative to coordinated response is chaos. This lesson applies to challenges we face now. Problems that affect everyone cannot be solved by individual action. They require coordination, shared sacrifice, long-term thinking. But coordination is difficult. Short-term interests resist. Nationalism resists. The same forces that prevented adequate response to 1816 prevent adequate response to challenges today. The agricultural improvements after 1816 reduced famine risk. Better crops, better storage, better distribution. Technology helped, but technology also created dependencies. Populations grew based on assumption of technological reliability. More people depended on systems that could fail. When those systems failed, more people died than would have died without the technology. This pattern intensifies. Modern systems feed billions, but create dependency on complex infrastructure, on supply chains, on stable climate. Disruption anywhere cascades everywhere. Technology is not solution by itself. It is tool. Tools can help, but tools can also create vulnerabilities larger than the problems they solve. 1816 teaches that we should not assume technology will save us, that we should design systems with redundancy, with resilience, with capacity to fail gracefully rather than catastrophically. That efficiency that creates fragility is not progress. Tambora was massive eruption, VEI 7, but larger eruptions have occurred. Such eruptions are orders of magnitude larger than Tambora. They would cause global catastrophe, making 1816 look mild. Volcanic winter lasting years. Crop failures worldwide. Collapse of complex systems. Such eruptions are rare, but not impossible. Probability is low. Consequence is civilization threatening. This is risk that cannot be ignored despite low probability, because impact would be so severe. 1816 teaches that worse is possible, that the extreme events of history are not the worst that can occur. that we should prepare for scenarios beyond historical experience. This requires humility, recognition that our experience is limited, that our models are incomplete, that the future may hold conditions unprecedented in human history. But preparation is possible, building resilient food systems, maintaining reserves, creating redundancy, developing response capacity. These investments have value even if worse never occurs, because they protect against range of risks. In June 1816, when snow fell in summer, when crops froze, when the future looked hopeless, people did not give up. They endured, they adapted, they survived. Mary Shelley, 18 years old, sitting in cold villa during summer that was not summer, created literature that endures 2 centuries later, hope expressed through art. Farmers who lost everything that year planted again the next year, hope expressed through action. Communities that organized relief, hope expressed through mutual aid. Governments that attempted solutions even when solutions seemed impossible. Hope expressed through policy. The human capacity for hope in impossible conditions is remarkable. This is not optimism, not belief that things will automatically improve, but refusal to surrender, determination to act even when action seems futile. 1816 teaches that hope is not passive, it is active. It is planting crops that might freeze. It is writing novels in darkness. It is helping neighbors when you barely have enough for yourself. It is continuing when continuation seems pointless. This lesson matters enormously as we face challenges. The situation may be grim, getting worse. The consequences may be severe. But surrender helps nothing. Action might help. Hope is what enables action. Tambora erupted in Indonesia. New England farmers starved. Swiss artists created literature. Irish tenants died. Monsoons failed in India. Crops withered in China. One event, one volcano, global consequences. The connections were invisible to people in 1816. They experienced local disaster, did not know it was global, did not know the cause was 10,000 miles away. We know now. We understand the connections, atmospheric circulation, trade networks, interconnected systems. We can trace how impacts cascade, but we do not always act on this knowledge. We treat problems as local when they are global. We ignore how our actions affect distant others. We fail to recognize our interdependence. 1816 teaches that these connections are real, that what happens in one place echoes globally, that we cannot isolate ourselves from distant events, that we are all in the same system. Not all deaths in 1816 were inevitable. The volcano erupted. That was beyond human control. The climate cooled. That could not be prevented. But how societies responded was choice. Ireland did not need to export grain while Irish people starved. Governments did not need to repress hungry people. Communities did not need to fracture under stress. Different choices would have saved lives. Better governance, more equitable distribution, stronger social support, international aid. These were possible. They did not occur because of political decisions. Those decisions killed people. This remains true. Physical events cause disruption. Sea levels rise, heat waves occur, droughts happen. These cause suffering. But how we respond determines how much suffering, how many die, who survives, whether disaster destroys systems or systems adapt. We can choose adaptation over denial, investment over austerity, cooperation over competition, equity over exploitation. These choices will determine outcomes. 1816 teaches that preventable suffering is failure, that when we have power to reduce harm and do not exercise it, we are responsible, that the deaths that could be prevented weigh on those who could have prevented them. We know 1816 because people documented it. Farmers kept diaries, scientists took measurements, governments wrote reports, Artists created works. All this evidence accumulated. Without that documentation, 1816 would be forgotten. A gap in historical consciousness. A missing piece. Future generations would not know, would not learn, would repeat mistakes. This argues for documentation of our era, of challenges we face, of our responses, of our failures. Future generations will need to know what we did, what we failed to do, what we learned, what we ignored. The record should be honest, not propaganda, not justification, but accurate account of decisions made and consequences accepted. This will be uncomfortable, will reveal responsibility, will preserve failures, but it will also preserve lessons, will help future generations avoid our mistakes, will provide wisdom earned through experience. 1816 teaches that we owe future generations truth. That documentation is not just historical exercise, but responsibility. 1816 was test. It revealed which governments were competent, which communities were cohesive, which individuals were generous, which systems were resilient. The revelation was not comfortable. Many governments failed, many communities fragmented, many individuals hoarded while neighbors starved, many systems proved fragile, but some passed. Some governments organized effective response, some communities cooperated magnificently, some individuals sacrificed for others, some systems adapted. Disaster reveals truth, strips away comfortable assumptions, shows what we actually value, who we actually are when tested. We will face tests, will reveal which nations protect their people, which are performative, which communities have genuine solidarity, which are collections of individuals, which systems are actually resilient, which just appeared strong during easy times. We can see previews. Events reveal patterns. Some governments protect their people. Others sacrifice them. Some communities pull together. Others descend into conflict. 1816 teaches that we should not wait for disaster to reveal our character, that we should build the capacity for cooperation before we need it, that we should create resilient systems before they are tested, that the time to become who we need to be is before testing arrives. Tambora erupted in April 1815. The impacts peaked in 1816. Conditions improved in 1817, normalized by 1818. From eruption to recovery, 3 years. This was short enough that memory remained vivid. People remembered the before, lived through the during, saw the after. The connection between event and consequence was traceable. Some problems operate on longer timescales. Causes today affect conditions decades later. Consequences unfold over generations. The connection between cause and effect is obscured by time. This makes response harder. Humans evolved to handle immediate threats. We are challenged by long-term risks. We discount future harm. We assume problems decades away can wait. But processes do not care about human psychology. Changes accumulate. Consequences proceed regardless of our attention span. 1816 teaches that some problems require acting on timescales that feel unnatural, that we must overcome our bias toward immediate over distant, that what seems far away may already be in motion. In 1816, no amount of prayer changed the weather. No political debate warmed the sun. No economic theory created food that did not exist. Nature operated according to physical law. Human wishes were irrelevant. This remains true. Physical processes proceed through natural law. Ice melts at specific temperatures. Oceans absorb specific amounts of heat. Ecosystems collapse at specific thresholds. We can negotiate treaties, can debate policies, can create markets, but we cannot negotiate with physics, cannot debate chemistry, cannot create markets that change fundamental natural laws. 1816 teaches that nature is non-negotiable, that we must work within physical constraints, that pretending otherwise is not strategy, but fantasy, that reality wins every argument eventually. If societies had been prepared for 1816, if grain reserves had been larger, if distribution systems had been better, if communities had been more cohesive, if governments had had plans, the catastrophe would still have occurred. But fewer would have died. Preparation is always more effective than emergency response. Building reserves is more efficient than emergency imports at famine prices. Creating resilient systems is better than repairing collapsed ones. But preparation requires investment before catastrophe. Spending on problems that have not occurred yet. This is difficult. Resources compete. Visible current needs seem more urgent than invisible future ones. Yet preparation is rational. Expected value calculation favors investment in resilience, even when probability is low, if consequence is severe. 1816 teaches that failure to prepare is choice to accept higher costs later, that societies that invest in resilience suffer less when tested, that the question is not whether to pay, but whether to pay up front or after catastrophe. Statistical knowledge of 1816 exists in archives, but it is inert. Researchers access it. Most people do not. The stories carry the wisdom. Frankenstein is read by millions. Byron's poem is studied. Folk tales of the year summer never came are still told. Stories reach people, data cannot. Create emotional understanding that numbers cannot provide. Preserve wisdom in forms that persist. This is why art matters, why literature matters, why we should tell stories. Not just report facts, but create narratives that carry those facts forward emotionally. 1816 teaches that if we want future generations to understand, we must tell stories, must create art, must preserve not just data but meaning, must make the abstract concrete and the distant present through narrative. Before 1816, people assumed they understood nature, that the patterns were known, that surprises were impossible. This assumption was arrogance. One volcano shattered it. We should recognize the same tendency in ourselves. We assume our models are complete. Our understanding is sufficient. Our technology will save us. Our institutions will endure. These assumptions are probably wrong. Not entirely wrong, but wrong enough that reality will surprise us, will reveal gaps in our understanding, will expose vulnerabilities we have not considered. 1816 teaches that humility is wisdom, that we should prepare for the possibility that we are wrong, that resilience requires admitting ignorance, that caution is not weakness, but intelligence. 1816 was not chosen. Tambora erupted without human input. The catastrophe that followed was natural disaster. But the response was chosen. How societies organized, how resources were distributed, how suffering was addressed or ignored, who was protected, who was abandoned. These were choices. Those choices revealed values. British Empire valued British lives more than Irish lives. Wealthy valued property rights more than preventing starvation. Some governments valued order more than justice, but some made different choices. Some communities chose solidarity. Some individuals chose generosity. Some leaders chose competent governance over political convenience. The outcomes reflected the choices. Those who chose cooperation survived better. Those who chose exploitation suffered more. Those who chose preparation recovered faster. Those who chose denial endured longer catastrophe. We face similar choice structure. Outcomes are not predetermined. Physics will unfold. But our response is choice. We can choose adaptation over denial, can choose cooperation over competition, can choose equity over exploitation. can choose resilience over fragility, can choose long-term over short-term, can choose solidarity over selfishness. Or we can choose the opposite, can deny until denial is impossible, can compete until competition destroys cooperation, can maintain exploitation until systems collapse, can choose short-term profit over long-term survival. 1816 teaches that these choices matter enormously, that they determine not just who survives, but what kind of civilization survives, whether we emerge from crisis stronger or shattered, whether we become better or worse through the testing. The future is not yet written. Some outcomes are constrained by physics, but the human response is choice. We choose what we become. 1816 shows us both possibilities, the communities that cooperated and survived, the systems that collapsed and failed. Both outcomes are available to us. 200 years separate us from the year without summer. We have advantages they lacked: better science, better technology, better communication, more resources, more knowledge. But we have the same choice they faced: how to respond when nature demonstrates our vulnerability, how to organize when systems are stressed, how to treat each other when resources are scarce, who to protect, who to abandon, what to value, what to sacrifice. 1816 cannot tell us what to choose, but it can show us what choices mean, can reveal what different responses produce, can demonstrate that our decisions determine outcomes. The year without summer is not just history, it is mirror. It reflects our present. It shows us ourselves under stress. It reveals patterns that recur. Nature is powerful. Civilization is fragile. Inequality is lethal. Government matters. Science helps, but understanding lags. Memory fades. Art preserves. Collective action works. Technology helps and harms. Worse is possible. Hope persists. Connection is real. Suffering is often preventable. Documentation matters. Disaster reveals character. Timescale obscures. Nature does not negotiate. Preparation is cheaper. Stories carry wisdom. Arrogance precedes fools. We choose what we become. These lessons were written in suffering 2 centuries ago. They remain true. We can learn from history or repeat it. The choice is ours. The year without summer ended, but the questions it raised remain. How do we survive what we cannot control? How do we build what can endure? How do we become who we need to be? Mount Tambora erupted once, killed hundreds of thousands, changed the world. Other volcanoes will erupt, and other challenges will test us in ways 1816 never did. The year without summer is prologue. What comes next depends on what we do now, on choices we make today, on whether we learn. History does not repeat exactly, but it rhymes. The rhyme scheme is clear. Disaster reveals, response determines, choices matter, consequences follow. 2 centuries ago, the sun dimmed. Summer failed. Hundreds of thousands died. Civilization was tested. Some passed. Some failed. All were changed. The sun will dim again through different mechanisms. Same result. We will be tested, are being tested. The question is not whether catastrophe will come. The question is who we will be when it arrives. 1816 gives us the answer in advance. We will be who we choose to be. Nothing more. Nothing less. The catastrophe will reveal that choice, but the choice is made before the catastrophe, in how we prepare, in what we build, in who we protect, in what we value. The year without summer teaches that the time to choose is now. Before the test, before the crisis, before the catastrophe reveals what we have built and who we have become. The choice is ours. The consequences will belong to our children, and their children, and all who come after. 200 years from now, will they look back at our time with understanding, with horror, with grief for preventable suffering? Or will they look back with recognition that we chose preparation over denial, cooperation over competition, wisdom over short-term gain, that we learned the lessons history taught, that we became who we needed to be? The year without summer is over. The lesson endures. Nature is powerful. We are vulnerable. How we respond to that vulnerability determines everything. The sun will rise tomorrow, and the tomorrow after, but it rises on a world we are shaping, a future we are making. 1816 teaches that the proper response to learning we are fragile is not denial, but preparation. The catastrophe of 1816 ended. The world recovered. Life continued. But scars remained. Memories persisted. Lessons were learned by those who survived. We are inheritors of those lessons, of that memory, of that warning. What we do with that inheritance is our choice, and our responsibility, and our legacy. The year without summer gives us the template, shows us the pattern, reveals the stakes, provides the warning. What we do with that warning is our choice, not once, but continuously, every day, every decision, every action, every choice to prepare or delay, to cooperate or compete, to protect or exploit, to remember or forget. 1816 teaches that these choices accumulate, that they build toward outcomes we cannot fully predict but can influence, that what we become is some of what we choose. The lesson is simple. Nature is powerful. We are vulnerable. How we respond matters. 200 years later, the lesson remains. The test continues. The choice is ours. May we choose wisely. May we choose well. May we choose in time. The year without summer is over. The story continues. We write the next chapter.